There we go.
Okay, welcome everybody. This is Chiro. We are still seeing your slide. A session on mentoring and monitoring. We have Chiro Vitavili and Christopher Stanton presenting papers, and then it's going to be me. We have 90 minutes. Sophia will help us with keeping track of time. But feel free to type the questions in the chat because we will only have time for 1 or 2 at the end of each paper and only then 15 minutes at the very end of the session. And also because it's useful for the authors, even if we cannot cover them, to look at those questions at the end. So with that, Chiro, please start, and I'm gonna take the time.
Thank you, Florenza. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm gonna share my screen now. Yeah, so today I'm going to present enhancing human capital at scale. This is a joint work with Francesco Agostinelli and with Matteo Bobba. There is a well-known urban-rural gap in educational opportunities, and this gap is even more dramatic in developing countries. And while there are many potential reasons behind this gap, definitely one of the main drivers is the inability of governments to provide quality education services in rural areas, especially rural areas. It's hard to recruit good teachers, to train them, and actually to retain them. These are some of the issues faced by CONAFE, that is a Mexican government organization that provides education in very rural areas. And in 2009, CONAFE, in the attempt to mitigate the issues related to the delivery of quality teaching, started a multifaceted mentoring program called the Asesores Pedagógicos Itinerantes, or mobile pedagogical mentors. And this is actually a mentoring program that builds on the community model run by CONAFE. So we had the opportunity, as part of the World Bank project, to work in direct collaboration with CONAFE to improve the design of the program and to evaluate in a sample of a school in a rural chapters. And while this clearly, working in close collaboration with the CONAFE, put some restriction on the research question we could address, it gave us the opportunity to design and evaluate a modality that was more scalable ex ante. So what do we do in this paper? We first take advantage of the existing organizational infrastructure of the mentoring program. And in the evaluation, we compare the standard modality, the one that was implemented at the time, that ends on, I will call, the API standard. And we evaluate this vis-a-vis a control group with no treatment, but we also compare it with a new version, an enhanced training for the mentor that I will call the API Plus modality. In 2016, CONAFE, after learning about the results of our pilot and evaluation, and autonomously decided to roll out the API Plus modality without actually the help of the World Bank. But for us, it gave us a unique opportunity to test the scalability of the program, because actually we can analyze both the experimental and the rollout regime in the same sample of schools. And just as a preview of the findings, we can, in the experimental evaluation, we can observe a large set of outcomes, including a test scores, behavioral measures, schooling outcomes. And we basically find no significant effect of the standard modality, the one that was in place at the time of the experiment on a large scale. We do find that the enhanced modality, the API Plus, has very large and statistically significant effect, When we studied the mechanism underlying the differential effect between the two modalities, we find that parents play a key role in explaining this differential effect. We then focus on the rollout, and this is not part of this paper. We collected the data, similar data in 2018, but for today's presentation, actually, I'm gonna focus on key two outcomes at scale. One is a transition from primary to secondary, and I will show that basically a full exposure to the program basically closes the gap between urban and rural area in transition to secondary school enrollment. But we also find evidence that parental engagement is a key variable to keep schools open in this very rural context, actually telling us something about some of the threats to scalability when we move from an RCT to a large scale impact, where often in an RCT, same as in ours, we try to keep schools open to reduce attrition. So I will say something about CONAFE. So CONAFE ran a community-based model in very rural marginalized areas. This is a multi-grade school with about 12 students on average per school in primary education. Instructors are from the community, and they have no formal training as teacher. So this is actually one of the reasons why we observe a very high turnover. About a quarter of the instructor quits every year. Less than, as a result, the outcome of CONAFE students are on average much worse than the national average. And this, for instance, like less than 2/3 of sixth graders in CONAFE enroll in secondary schooling, when the average rate is 95%. In the CONAFE model, parents have a big role because they oversee the functioning of a school through schedule, pedagogical material, etc. So in 2009, CONAFE launched the Asesores Pedagógicos Itinerantes, or mobile mentoring program, to tackle inequality, especially for the most disadvantaged schools. Mentors are selected among recent university graduates, and usually they sign a 2-year agreement with the CONAFE. And when they are assigned to the communities, the mentors usually do 3 activities that are strictly regulated by the program guidelines. They do one-to-one face tutoring for worst performing students, and this takes, according to the guidelines, 60% of their time. They provide pedagogical support to the instructors about 15% of the time, and 25% of the time they conduct home visits. In 2013, just before the beginning of our evaluation, there were 2,100 mentors that were assigned to the poorest municipalities in Mexico. We started the experiment in 2014. We had 230 schools that had never received the program in very rural areas of Chiapas. We conduct a block randomization using a school level test scores at the baseline. And the assignment is as follows. 100 schools were assigned to the control group with the non-mentor. 70 schools were assigned to the program that resembled the original design. And finally, 6 schools were assigned to the enhanced training version of the program. Let me tell you something more about the enhanced version. So there are 2 main features. Rather than having 1 week of training at the beginning, in the enhanced version, the mentors receives 2 weeks of training, with the 2nd week that is focused exclusively on teaching math and reading, with a very hands-on approach. Then the other main difference is that in the enhanced group, the tutors meet on a bi-monthly basis for about 18 hours to just share experience, issues, and how they tackle those issues. Everything else is basically the same for the standard modality and the plus modality. We have, especially in the evaluation data, we have a very rich data and measurement. So we measure early grade reading assessment and early grade math assessment for all students in grade 3rd to 6th. We measure child behavioral issues through mother reports. Using administrative data, we can measure transition from primary to lower secondary in 2016, 2017. We have the home questionnaire to observe parental activities and parent-mentor interaction. And we have an adapted version of the Stallings, the classroom observation, to measure the quality of instruction in the multi-grade context. In the rollout, for today, I will primarily focus on two outcomes. One is the transition from to secondary school in 2017-2018, and the other one is a direct observation of school closing in 2018. It means 4 years after the program was started. Why is it particularly relevant in our case? Because roughly, on average, 20% of schools in our sample closed between the end of the evaluation and 2018. And this is pretty much the same share of CONAFE schools that close nationwide. Because of the context, these schools are often too small, and CONAFE has to close them. In the evaluation, clearly, we ask CONAFE not to close the school unless there were only 1 or 2 students. That is not the case for the rollout. So, and this is the main impacts, from the experimental design. We find basically no statistically significant effect of the standard modality, either on reading or math. The coefficients are positive but small. We do instead find pretty sizable effects of the plus modality, with the 0.3 standard deviation effect on reading and 0.24 standard deviation on math, with the difference between standard plus that is always statistically significant at the conventional level. There is also a positive effect of the API plus on the social emotional scores, but this is not statistically significant from the standard impact. And finally, we look at the transition from primary to secondary. And here I would like to stress that basically after 2 years, the plus modality increased a transition to secondary of a 12 percentage point, up from the 62% in the control group. So this is a very large increase in transition from primary to secondary. We focus on the possible driver, and here I will just give you a summary of basically what is the main mechanism that we find to matter, that is parental involvement. Just for sake of time, I'm gonna just describe the results for 2 summary measures that we created a 2-factor analysis. One is engagement with the school of the parents, that is participation to school activity management, if they actually help with the work in the school. And then the other one is direct parental involvement with student education. So basically, if they supervise their homework, they engage students in other activities. And what we find is that the standard modality has either a 0 effect or negative effect, while the plus has a very large effect on both measures, about 0.2 standard deviation. And the difference is always statistically significant. We also observe other mechanisms. So when we look at the teacher practices through the stallings, basically we find that both programs improve teacher management, but there is no differential effect. Therefore, we don't think that teacher practices can explain the results. We also use a particular feature of the program to isolate the effect of the remedial session that I described in the beginning. And we also don't find that the remedial education can explain the differential impact between standard and plus. So both have a positive effect, but there is no differential effect due to the remedial. So in summary, when we try to explain this differential impact between the standard modality and the one that we piloted, we find that the parents are the key driver of the effect. Therefore, the enhanced training basically improved the interaction between the tutor and parents. So let me now go to the scale up. So in 2016, we ended the evaluation, we presented our results, and the government autonomously decided to scale up the API Plus modality nationwide to the 2,100 instructors I described in the beginning. It was a staggered role design that started in 2016, and that basically created a variation because in our original sample, 60% of the school received at least 1 year of exposure between 2016 and 2018. And because of the randomization, the probability of receiving the program in the scale up is balanced across the 3 treatment groups. So we have a pretty unique opportunity to study the effect of the program at scale, because we can actually observe the outcome on the same set of schools we had used for our evaluation. One of the main issue of, like we actually were concerned about is that schools could close now in the scale up, something that was not allowed by default in the evaluation.
Sorry, you have 5 minutes.
Okay, perfect. So the question we want to address is basically, do the experimental effects fade out during the national rollout? And for this, we use an IV strategy. Basically, we instrument the exposure to the plus modality using the original assignment to the plus. And then in the second stage, we evaluate the marginal effect of the API plus on top of receiving the standard modality. And when we look at the transition to secondary, you see that, not surprisingly, the reduced form results show that the plus has a very strong effect on now transition to secondary between 2017 and 2018. And our IV results show that basically 1 year of exposure to the API plus increases the probability of transitioning by 9 percentage points. And these actually, these effects are pretty much similar to the one that we observe with the ordinary least squares, that give us a measure of this impact at scale of the program. So as I mentioned, one of the key issues for us, one of our main concern, and the reason why actually we are not presenting the results on EGRA and EGRAMA that we collected in 2018, is that we observe a selective closing of the schools. But actually, this turned out to be an outcome and we were really interested in when assessing the scalability. And what we see is that schools that had received the API modality for 4 years were almost a 0.4 percentage point more likely to be open than the one that had never received the API modality. And you see that there is actually a positive effect that increases with the exposure to the program. Now, what we try to do in the last part of the paper, making some assumption, is basically to understand whether this increased probability of school reopening can be linked to the increase in parental engagement that we have observed in the experimental results. And therefore, what we do, we use the parental engagement in 2016. We instrument it with the assignment to the API Plus. And then we look at the relation between parental engagement at the locality level, instrumented with the original assignment, vis-a-vis the probability of a school being open in 2018. So 2 years after the end of the pilot. And what you see is that there is a clear positive relationship between parental engagement at the village level and the probability of school being open. And the effect is statistically significant at the conventional level. So let me conclude. So we study a scalable educational mentoring program in Chiapas, and we find that this program that actually was designed together with the CONAFE, according to the resources available for CONAFE at the time, was successful in closing educational gaps between urban and rural children. I think what we find that is the main result of this paper is that a key role behind the scalability is the role of parents. So especially in this rural context where teachers go, drop out, the ones who stay are parents, no? And parents is really important to involve parents in the project, in the education of their children. And this is what we achieved through the home visits. And most important, this effect stayed over time, didn't fade out. And we therefore find evidence now that the quality of educational services is actually linked to the engagement of the community, something that more intervention should try to boost. I think I'm done. I hope to be on time, Florence.
Thank you, Ciro. I don't see questions in the chat, but maybe we have 1 minute. If anybody has any question, they might raise their hands, 1 or 2 questions, or I'm not seeing any questions, but oh.
Well, I had one, but I'm up next. And so I guess I can ask the question and then transition. I was wondering if you think that parental involvement would persist if the program weren't in place. So is it that the continued access to the new program is what's driving parental involvement, or do you think that this is something that would be persistent in the absence of the program because it kind of jump-started involvement at an earlier time?
So I mean, the effect seems to persist. You know, clearly longer exposure seems to have a positive effect also. So we think that since there is this positive increasing effect on a reopening, we think that the more parents are exposed, the better, no? But in the end, also the ones did not receive after 2016 also display a higher probability of the school reopening in 2018 vis-a-vis the ones that did not receive. So let's say, I think, you know, some of the effect stayed, but clearly a longer exposure increased the parental engagement.
Got it. Oh, okay, good. Yeah, I think I understand how you're getting at that from the IB.
Feel free to start. I take your time, Christopher.
Oh, okay. Let me try to find the presentation. So thanks for having us. This is a paper that is less in the context of development and more in the context of mentorship programs inside a firm. And the title of this paper is Treatment and Selection Effects of Formal Workplace Mentorship Programs, with a host of co-authors. And the motivation, if I can move forward, and we tested this earlier and now it doesn't seem to be working, is that we have a prior field experiment that is in the QJE in 2020, where we randomly paired coworkers together in meetings and then looked at their productivity gains over time, over a period of 6 months after that intervention. And what we found in that intervention is that the gains from pairing coworkers together and having them talk about their work processes persisted and substantially sort of raised productivity, especially for workers who are at the bottom of the productivity distribution. And as a result, it led us to sort of ask the question that if these very sort of cheap interventions were able to raise on-the-job productivity for a subset of workers at the bottom of the productivity distribution, why are these folks not getting benefits organically? Or what was it that the relatively inexpensive 2 hours of meetings did for people in the absence of sort of they're seeking out that help on their own? And so for us, it raises the questions of who participates and benefits from training programs more generally. And at least in the US, training programs are common within firms. And one particular training program is especially common, which is mentoring programs. And these mentoring programs take place at least in sort of 70% of the Fortune 500 largest companies in the US. But their implementation details differ somewhat dramatically. So some firms will assign a mentor to new hires immediately when they join, while others have voluntary programs that seem to use an opt-in approach that would allow any individual to participate if they want to, but they don't need to. And so what we end up doing in this paper is just comparing the efficacy of these different approaches to mentorship programs. But we think the design is probably useful for other contexts to look at the difference between a self-selected group in terms of understanding heterogeneous treatment effects versus those that are sort of pushed into the program. And so the questions that we'll attempt to address with an RCT is, first, does having a mentor raise productivity and improve retention at work? And it turns out that this is not necessarily settled in terms of debate or in terms of point estimates, despite an enormous literature, especially from social psychology, on the effects of mentorship. Many of these studies are observational or anecdotal, and they tend to blend treatment and selection effects, meaning that in most programs, we would sort of expect that good people select into getting mentored. And so it's difficult to understand what the counterfactual is for these people who are likely to be the go-getters or the high flyers in any workplace to begin with. The estimates that I am most familiar with, because I wrote some of these papers, tend to instead focus on bosses or supervisors. But if you think about the supervision relationship, this tends to blend authority and other features of mentoring. And so one of the things that we'll try to focus on here is mentorship programs that are absent selection effects and authority. And we just want to understand what the average treatment effect is if you sort of allocated mentorship at random. The second thing we try to understand is who seeks out mentorship and who opts into mentorship when it's available, if it's a self-selected program. And then third, we want to understand whether mentorship disproportionately benefits those who opt in versus those who otherwise wouldn't opt in when we nudge them or push them into the program. And then finally, we have a targeting question, which is, can we say something about whether self-selection or other targeting rules would allocate mentors to proteges with little efficiency loss? Meaning, can we sort of get the most gains in terms of treatment effects from some set of allocations of mentors to proteges compared to others under certain targeting rules or under self-selection? All right, so how do we do it? We have an RCT with 2 high-level branches that are assigned at the new hire cohort level in an inbound sales call center. And let me just describe the two branches. The first is what we term broad mentoring, where new recruits or new hires get randomized into whether they have a mentor or not. So imagine that you're a new sales agent at a call center, and you start training with 10 to 12 other people. And your training class, if it's in the broad mentoring training class, is going to go through a 2-week training period. And then at the end of that training period, a subset of individuals will be pulled aside privately and will be told whether they're assigned to a mentor. And if the individual in the training class is not assigned to a mentor, they just kind of get told nothing other than that other opportunities would be available if they ask about why some people are getting mentored or not. The second high-level arm is what we call selective mentoring. And in cohorts where new recruits join the firm that are in this high-level branch, new recruits are asked on the first day of training whether they want to opt into a mentorship program or not. And they're just asked to write this down on a piece of paper so that they don't see who opts in or opts out. And so there is not this sort of collective thing where potentially everyone in a training class is kind of pressured by their peers who are opting in, or pressured by their peers who are opting in. And so on the first day of training, people write yes or no, I want to opt into the mentorship program or not. And then those who opt in are then randomized into having a mentor in the same type of way that the broad mentoring group works. But importantly, those who opt out get no mentor by design. Okay, so after the allocation question for these two arms, or these two branches, those who are allocated a mentor are matched with someone at random from the firm. This tends to be a senior person in sales who has more experience and is a relatively productive sales agent, but this is not someone at the managerial level. So this is really someone sort of who is a peer in terms of authority and in terms of whether there is going to be like any on-the-job evaluation. There's no sort of evaluation, there's no authority. This is just someone who's sort of more advanced at the firm, but at the same level. So the mentorship relationship begins after the 2-week training program, and then it lasts 4 weeks. Mentors and proteges have a 30-minute block every week where the firm schedules that they will have time together to where they're not on sales calls. And then after this 4-week program, we can kind of track productivity during the program, and then we track productivity and retention through 6 months. One of the great things about an inbound sales call center is that we have an individual level measure of productivity for every agent in any experimental condition. So we can track sales revenue by day. And as a result, we can say something at a very granular level about the productivity effects of the program. So what were mentors told? So mentors were told to help onboard new employees and to give them tips and tricks. And to guide this interaction, we gave individuals who were in the mentorship program worksheets to guide interactions and conversations with their mentors. But importantly, it allows us as part of the design to record what happens, because mentors were given sort of kudos dollars to use at the company store, only conditional on turning in these worksheets after these meetings occurred. So we have text records of what actually happened in these meetings that we can use to try and disentangle some of the mechanisms. Okay, this is just an illustration of the design. So we had 53 cohorts of new hires who joined the firm during the time that the experiment was live. And this included 603 new agents who were part of these 53 cohorts. And in branch 1, we assigned 22 cohorts to broad mentoring. And of these, 110 agents received a mentor and 171 agents did not. If agents who did not receive a mentor asked about sort of asymmetric mentoring, they were told that there was a limited supply of mentors and that the firm randomized who received a mentor to make sure that the allocation was fair, and that there would be other opportunities to receive on-the-job training for those who didn't receive a mentor. In practice, basically no one who did not receive a mentor asked any of these questions because the program was sort of designed to not be salient for those who weren't randomized into it. The second branch, selective mentoring, had 31 cohorts and 322 agents. And this asymmetry was by design because we wanted to be able to try and estimate who opted in or opted out of the program as a result of the observables that we could see about agents. So it turns out that 59 of these 322 agents ended up opting out of the program. 263 agents opted in on their first day of training. And then you can see in condition 2A and condition 2B on the right-hand side here, what the allocation of mentors was in the selective branch. Okay, so there are some key details that you have to understand about this setting to understand what we do. And let me move the screen down a little bit so you can probably see it a bit better. So in this firm, sales agents answer randomly allocated incoming calls for TV, phone, and internet products. And a key sort of aspect of the job is that agents must manage their time, including the time that they're on the phone, their scheduled breaks, other scheduled meetings, which sort of determines their time allocation and their adherence to schedule. And then on a call, agents need to sort of understand customer needs to match packages that are available to those needs, and then try to upsell customers to better deals. And this is going to result in higher revenue, which we can measure. Okay, if you get nothing else out of this, this is sort of the core result of the talk. So what I've displayed here is log daily average revenue by treatment condition or branch. And if you just compare the broad mentoring branch, conditions 1A and 1B, you can see that there is, based on experimental variation, a large difference between those who are mentored in condition 1A and those who are non-mentored in condition 1B. The difference here is about 19 log points, or about 20% in terms of a daily revenue lift over the first 2 months of tenure that these agents work at the firm. In contrast, if you compare those agents who are in selective or opt-in mentorship who did opt-in, between those who are mentored and those who are non-mentored, you see no differential effect. And in fact, the difference is slightly negative between those who are mentored conditional on opting in and those who are not mentored conditional on opting in. But then when we compare these two agents in condition 2A and condition 2B with those in condition 2C, who ultimately ended up opting out of the program, you see broad productivity differences across these groups. Now, what's driving this? So agents in this condition 2B don't receive mentorship, and neither do agents in condition 2C, but the productivity differences here on the job are dramatic. And so as a result, what's happening is selection bias between those who opt into the program and those who opt out, with those who opt out being much less productive than those who opt in. If you think about this from the firm's perspective, you would hope that if the firm allowed selection into a program, like a training program, that the selection would be positively correlated with the gains from the program. And you would thus hope that those who are likely to gain would sort of lift them from the bottom tail of the productivity distribution. That apparently isn't happening here, but we suspect it's happening, and this is what's driving the gains in the broad mentoring treatment group. But you can sort of see that in this figure, there is evidence of selection bias into who participates in the program. Those who participate are likely to be much higher productivity agents at baseline, whereas the treatment effects from the program when it's deployed broadly are just much larger. All right, and I'll try to make this formal in a second. Okay, so based on this figure, here are our main findings, and then we'll try to formalize this with some econometrics. The first is that mentorship programs work on average. Agents who are in the broad group have about 20% increases in revenue in the first 2 months on the job. They have improved call productivity, meaning that on any given call that we can see them answer, they're more likely to make a sale, and they're likely to have higher sale revenue. And their time use is more likely to meet company standards. And in broad mentorship, their turnover likelihood is also reduced. We can document positive but imprecise effects in months 3 to 6 on the job for all of these measures. In contrast, in the selective mentoring group, we have much lower treatment effects, approximately 0 on almost all call productivity measures for those agents who opt into the program. But mentored agents do have positive retention effects in the selective group. If we combine points 1 and 2, it implies that there are heterogeneous returns to mentoring and negative selection based on productivity gains. And we can recover this based on a pre-registered approach to get at heterogeneous treatment effects as a function of who selects into the program. Okay, point 4 is that we attempted to do this program to help understand demand side frictions that would prevent people from seeking out help at work or from opting into training opportunities. And what we end up finding here is that those with the highest benefit from workplace interaction or mentorship or training are the least likely to access these programs on their own when given the opportunity to do so voluntarily. As part of our design, we attempted to collect personality and demographic factors based on surveys and based on the firm's personnel database. But these factors basically do very little to explain the opt-in or the opt-out decision. And so our attempt to try to understand who does not take advantage of these programs based on personality and demographic factors is largely a failure. It appears that selection is largely based on unobservables rather than things that we can observe. Importantly, however, we cannot assess miscalibrated expectations. So we can't tell you whether people don't opt into the program because they don't forecast the gains, because we sort of didn't want to prime people to think about the gains to then potentially change the allocation, because we don't think that that sort of mimics what actually happens in most firms. So it's unlikely that most managers would say, think about the gains from a program and then opt in or opt out. It's mostly sort of an organic process. Okay, the 5th point is that it is unlikely that the firm can significantly improve the allocation compared to either random or universal mentoring. There were 2 possibilities that we assess. The first is self-selection, but the experimental results indicate that this is worse than doing random allocation of mentorship. And the second thing that we try is to predict the treatment gains from observables, but this is unlikely to work. The R-squared from these regressions of opt-out on characteristics, including personality characteristics, is quite low, implying selection on unobservables again. And then when we interact the treatment gains from mentorship in the broad group with characteristics, it yields sort of inconclusive targeting rules. So it seems like it's sort of a hard problem for the firm to solve in order to get the allocation right, unless the program is sort of allocated either broadly or universally or at random. Okay, I think that I am actually almost out of time. I still have a bunch of stuff in the talk. So let me go through sort of this very, very quickly. This is a photo of the workspace in the firm. The individuals who work here average about $21 an hour in earnings. The average for similar occupations in the state where the firm is located is about $20. And importantly, this firm is just a little bit younger than the average for similar call centers, where the average age here is 26 versus 33 for the industry average. But this is a relatively high earning entry-level job compared to other entry-level jobs that would be available for this set of workers. Then in terms of the protocol, mentors were sort of given instructions about how to structure their interactions. And there was a relatively high take-up rate between when we told people that they should be meeting and whether meetings actually occurred. So we can document that at least 82% of meetings occurred based on the worksheets that the firm provided to structure this interaction and for us to collect data about what actually happened in these conversations.
Just to tell you 5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. I better move on quickly.
Yeah.
Okay, everything's balanced. I'm gonna skip this, but note that there's about an 18% opt-out rate, where sort of 1/5 of the agents who were eligible for opting into the program in the selective category chose not to. And we think that this number is important because we believe it's driving the gains that we observe in broad mentorship. Okay, let me just show you some estimates of treatment effects. We have log revenue per call, log revenue per hour. And then what I didn't tell you about before is treatment effects on tenure, making it through 1 and 2 months with the firm. And you can see the interaction of mentorship with the broad indicator compared to just those agents who are mentored in the selective group and the broad group at baseline. And the broad mentorship is just quite a bit more effective on total revenue, revenue per call, revenue per hour. But if we only look at tenure with the firm, we see that agents who are just mentored compared to those who are not, among agents who opted in or didn't have the chance to opt in, we raised tenure for the first month, but this effect kind of fades out longer term. These effects are much less precise over the 3 to 6 month horizon, but you can still see that they're broadly positive. Precision goes down because this is a relatively high attrition environment, and productivity also fans out. And so the residual here just is much noisier as we get to longer horizons. Okay, let me tell you just a little bit about how we estimate heterogeneous treatment effects. So we pre-registered an approach to get at this based on whether agents opt in or opt out of the program. And then we tried to estimate heterogeneous treatment effects conditional on opting in or opting out. Now, obviously, we have to infer the heterogeneous treatment effect for those who opt out based on the mixture of treatment effects for those who did not have the opportunity to opt out in the broad group. And we have an approach that was pre-registered to get at this. I'll just go through this and save the details. But we estimate that the treatment effects for those who opt out of the program are enormous. They're bigger than what I would have expected, but this is the approach that we pre-registered before we saw the data. And this is basically telling you that the effect that we estimate is an effect that doubles revenue and increases average productivity per call by about 70% for those agents who would have opted out if given the opportunity. So it looks like this is raising the lower tail of the productivity distribution. I believe these effects are too big. And when we do something that tries to discipline these effects in a GMM approach based on observables, we get effects that are about 80% revenue lift for agents who we believe are starting out about 50% lower in terms of average revenue productivity compared to their compatriots who opted into the program. Okay. Let me just say one thing about targeting. I know many of you are in development, and targeting is an important feature. The question we asked is whether we could target mentorship to those with sort of low hiring scores or other observables. In productivity regressions in the broad group, basically nothing of interest survives the lasso in terms of how the firm could do this targeting based on observables. And so what we basically think is that unobservables are largely driving the decision about who opts out and the correlation with gains from treatment. Okay, there are a couple of robustness checks based on discouragement and information leakage and other things. I don't have time to go through these. I'll just tell you that there is nothing to be concerned, although we designed the experiment in a way that would allow us to test for these factors that we worried about ex ante. Okay, let me just conclude with a discussion in maybe one slide. So we can estimate how much the firm gained from the broad mentoring program and what the allocation loss would have been from allowing this elective option. So the total 6-month net present value from the broad mentorship program at a fairly high discount rate annually, after we also account from the mentorship time away, the mentor's time away from the phone, the administrative costs and the like, was about $900,000. But this omits reduced turnover costs. So this was substantial in sort of driving increased revenue for the firm. However, the differential gain from broad mentorship is about 20% per agent, or about $2,400 to $3,100 per agent month in revenue over the first 2 months. So if we just look at the effect of the misallocation over these first 2 months of tenure, with 114 slots for mentorship in the selective cohorts, the suboptimal allocation yields a loss of about $500,000 to $700,000 in revenue over this time frame. So the allocation loss based on setting up the program was substantial relative to the baseline gain. Okay, what do we conclude? So mentoring is valuable when applied broadly. The gains here were likely due to knowledge exchange based on what we can read out of agents' worksheet entries after they were turned in. This is kind of consistent with our QJE 2020 paper. But what we find is those who benefit most from seeking out help are often those who fail to do so. And it likely sort of confirms that demand side frictions prevent people from closing productivity gaps on the job. But the exact source of this is unclear based on our design. And it turns out that broad programs seem to be most effective in solving for problematic opt-out. So with the firm nudging people to participate in the program, it makes it seem like the programs are much more effective. Okay, I'm a little bit over time. I apologize, and sorry for going quickly.
If there are no questions, I do have 2 of my own, but I don't see anything on the chat. But if anybody wants to raise their hand? Nope. Okay, I have two comments, Christopher. Great paper and an amazing topic. And on this conclusion that the exact source is not clear, and what are those unobservables that you don't see that drive this selection? My question is, have you tried or have you measured psychological things such as locus of control, greed, self-perspectives? There are all those psychological and behavior measures that usually do are better predictors of these kind of things, of demand for such as, because it's like a help, it's allowing others to help you. That is, how do you measure that? That's the one, and I give my second instantly. So this is a mentorship at a really junior level, say, these are sales agents. Have you, so do you have any ideas on mentorship for more senior levels, whether you might find similar results, or I don't know if it's part of your research? Thank you.
Yeah, so on the first one, the personality factors that we tried to measure are extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, emotional stability, and openness. These sort of parallel the big five.
The big five.
Yeah, but we did them with a relatively condensed survey instrument because people are relatively inattentive in this setting and the opportunity cost of their time is somewhat high. So none of those personality measures work, but it is possible that the survey instrument that we used was probably too coarse to really dig down into sort of conscientiousness or openness and self-control factors more broadly. I'm not sure I trust this survey instrument now that it kind of doesn't show up and we would have expected it to. I also agree with your assessment that this is relatively junior. And one of the things that I don't know about is whether some of these allocation issues would be solved as people try to progress through the firm. So you would sort of expect that self-selection happens on the extensive margin where people turn over. And then you might have a very sort of different effect of the program for people who are more experienced. At least internally, this doesn't seem to sort of be first order for the firm's perspective, but it does probably mean that the external validity of whether you would think about this in other contexts is something that you should extrapolate from. So I would say that the extrapolation that I'm more comfortable with is saying that in entry-level jobs, there's huge productivity dispersion, and some of these programs can lift the lower tail. I don't know what this would look like if we were thinking about sort of more senior executives who are trying to climb up the corporate ladder.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thanks.
So my turn then, Sophia. I appreciate if you let me know about the time. So it's a pleasure to present a paper on integrating early childhood with health services. This is experimental evidence from the Cresa com Seu Filho home visiting program in Fortaleza, Brazil, and it's joint work with Maria de la Paz Ferro, now a PhD candidate at the University of California of San Diego, and Pedro Carneiro, a professor at University College London. This is really an ECD impact evaluation. I think the mentoring session is because involves a lot of mentoring of parents. So this study presents a short-term impact of an at-scale home visiting program for vulnerable, very vulnerable children, ages 0 to 3, which was entirely integrated into primary health services. There are a couple of home visiting evaluations at scale, such as a recent one in Peru, another one coming up in Nicaragua, but none of them has been integrated into health services. As a preview, we found modest impacts on the home environment of about 0.12 standard deviation in the intent to treat estimate, and a substantial effect on the treatment on the treated. We do not find impacts on time investment in the child, nor on the final outcomes such as child development. The motivation of this type of studies and programs is that home visiting by community health workers to local families have been discussed as a particular, in the next slide, as a particular promising way of providing psychosocial stimulation to young children, improving parenting practices and child development. There is a very famous and widely cited study from Jamaica from the late 80s, where that now has a long-term follow-up, just published a month ago in the MBER working papers, that shows that after 30 years, or where kids 9 to 24 months of age were visited for about an hour weekly by community health workers, they have huge impacts on earnings, behavior, and health. There is a 43% increase in wages of these kids that received those home visits 30 years ago. However, those home visits are often very costly to implement. This is a problem for fiscal space in low and middle income countries. And in Colombia, that the price for that intervention is about $500 per year per child. And that's why it's been recommended to integrate these home visits, the child development home visits, into existing health services to leverage the existing platform, the existing staff, the existing training. And when looking at programs implemented from within the health sector, there are very few, if almost none, programs focusing on child development. There are home visitings, this focus on breastfeeding or health issues, but not on child development. And the very few experimental evaluation of this type of program do show positive results on child development in Pakistan, Jamaica, China, and Gambia. However, with the exception of the Gambia study, none of them was implemented at scale. They were control trials, which makes the things very, very different. And they were all implemented by research teams, not by a government like this one, in a very limited number of locations and with really few families. So the context, some of you might know that since the 90s, Brazil has a universal health coverage achieved through a unified health system called SUS, Sistema Único de Saúde, that offers community primary health care via the Estrategia Saúde da Família. And this strategy prioritizes health prevention and promotion and is composed of multidisciplinary teams that include a health practitioner, a health nurse, a technician, and a community health worker. Community health workers do tasks related to health promotion, including guiding and supporting people who need care, such as the elderly or the pregnant women, conducting home visiting, and stimulating participating in health activities related to the control of epidemics. They have been extremely active in the COVID context and in the vaccination context, for instance. The Programa Crece con Seu Filho was launched in 2014 in Fortaleza, Brazil, by the mayor's office and the Secretary of Health, and in the context of an unprecedented prioritization for early childhood development, including wide increases to access for childcare. So, and it was developed within the Estrategia Saúde da Família, as I said, that was the innovation, and it started out in 3 of the most vulnerable regions, administrative divisions, region 1, 5, and 6, to then be scaled up to the rest of the city, which has 4 million inhabitants. It's now serving almost 40,000 kids under age 3 in Fortaleza, and it was a joint evaluation effort between the IDV and the Fortaleza government. The program, in the next slide, the Programa Crece con Seu Filho were weekly 1-hour visits for vulnerable children with vulnerable households with children age 0 to 3, carried out by trained community health workers from the Brazilian primary healthcare system. And these children were visited for 2 years or until they turned 3. The structured curricula was inspired by Rio Grande do Sul's experience, the pioneer Programa Infancia Melhor, the theoretical foundations of the more intelligent and sensitive child curriculum, and the Jamaican model, the Reach Up and Learn. The activities were designed to promote different child development domains, such as motor, language, cognition, and social-emotional development, but with a particular focus on improving parenting practices, and also the activities were increasing in complexity as the child grows up. So it's not the same an activity for a 6-month-old than for a 2-year-old. And also the module, the child development module was designed around the primary care services. So this module was reviewed in conjunction with all the other services that were priorities for the target population, with the promotion of breastfeeding, with the preventing diarrhea in children, with the immunization, together. So, and this also is part of the innovation. There was a two-tier supervision system at the individual level for the community health worker, and also groups of community health workers will meet with a nurse who was the supervisor to review how the visits were going, what could be improved, etc. The evaluation was carried out in Region 5 of the municipality of Fortaleza, where we were allowed to do the randomization. There were 480 micro areas. Micro areas are small administrative areas, smaller than neighborhoods, used by the Secretary of Health to allocate workload to community health workers. And those were randomly assigned half and half to treatment and control. And each community health worker is usually assigned to a single micro area. So these randomizations results in a de facto randomization at the community health worker level. And the treatment community health workers what will happen differently from the control is that 16 hours of their 40 hours a week work will be devoted to the Programa Crece con Seu Filho activities, which include visiting a maximum of 9 children per week, recording the visits in the system, and participating in the supervision session with the nurse, while the control community health workers will continue with their usual community health level promotion task as designed in the Estrategia Salud de la Familia. So in a way, we have an active control. The sample, we in 2016, we made a census of all eligible children living in Region 5. According to power calculation, then we selected randomly a minimum of 7 children per micro area to interview. The baseline data collection happened between February and July 2016, and the follow-up information was collected between March and July 2019. We didn't find any attrition to be associated with assignment to the treatment group, and the eligible children for the program were children 0 to 28 months old with a child or a mother registered in the social program registry of Brazil, where, for instance, beneficiaries of Bolsa Familia are registered, which is called CadÚnico. And also, based on a poverty status, the eligible children have to have that age, be in the registry, but also be in a household with a monthly income up to 500 reais, which is at the time was about $120 per month. In the right side of the screen, you can see the randomization, how it happened in baseline and then in follow-up, and the number of children in each of the treatment arms. So I want to share in the next slide about the implementation challenges, because this is important to interpretation of our results. We had low adherence to the program. 3 out of 10 community health workers had not conducted a single visit as of June 2019. That was when the evaluation was already finishing, which means that only 7 out of 10 conducted at least 1 visit. And even within that group of those who conducted at least 1 full visit, the numbers of children visited and the number of visits per child was low. How this impacts our study? Well, we had low compliance. When we look at our survey, only 11% of the children in treatment micro area were indeed visited. And the number of visits of the children received was much smaller than the number of visits envisioned in the original design, who was about 24 visits per child. If you see the graph, I want to tell a little bit about that graph that shows the monthly number of home visits by community health worker over time. And I want to tell you what those red lines are. What we did in 2018 is we were monitoring on time the implementation, and we saw this low adherence. So we implemented with the government several changes and strategies to see how would this might improve adherence. So we relaxed the number of children to be visited from the original minimum of 9 to a range of 6 to 9. Tablets were purchased and distributed as a reward to the best community health workers, so the one visiting more children. So there was an incentive mechanism. The program created also a full-time position to support implementation, and a system of performance-based bonuses was also created. As you can see on the blue line, on average, this didn't change much, just very marginally the adherence, but it did change the adherence and the fidelity of the intervention for the top community health workers, so the P90. And on average, depending on the child's age, what we see is that about between 40 and 60% of the expected number of visits was achieved. And in similar interventions, significant effects on child development are found only when children receive between 16 and 24 visits. However, in these studies, not only the effects are measured immediately after the home visit ends, in hours, the amount of time between the last visit and the follow-up was 18 months, but also they all assess programs that are not at scale. So now, yes, I go into the empirical strategy. We basically, this is an RCT, so basically we ran two models, an intent to treat and a treatment on the treated, where the ITT is equal to 1 if the child lived in a treatment micro area at baseline, or 0. Otherwise, this is estimated by ordinary least squares, and the standard errors are clustered at the micro area level. And in the treatment on the treated, we have the number of visits received, that estimated by instrumental variables. Well, we instrument the number of visits received by that child with a random assignment to the treatment. And again, the standard errors are clustered at the micro area level. So in the next slide, we see that we do achieve balance at baseline, except for two variables, which is violence in the neighborhood and whether the household is visited by Estrategia Salud de Familia, and we control for that in the regressions. I won't tell you much about the stats. You can see them because I see I'm running out of time, but let me go straight into the results. So from this main table, the impact of an extra visit, so the TOT is quite high. Of course, you can argue with the estimates, but suppose you believe them. For every additional visit, you have a 0.75 standard deviation impact. So this says that the main reason why the program was not successful in the ITT was probably because most households had very few visits. So even if we think that the marginal impact of each visit will decline with the number of visits, it's plausible that, say, after 10 visits or so, the impact could be substantial. You could probably not 10 times 0.075, but probably substantial. And this is just less than half of the 24 programs that the program designed. So based on what we see, it's not unlikely that with more visits performed, we could see a larger change in the home environment, and as a consequence on child outcomes that we are not seeing in this table. So as you see, there are no impacts on child development, neither on the ITT or the TOT, no impacts on the health of the child. It's just on the responsiveness and discipline of the home indicator that we find this 0.075 impact. So let me move into the conclusions, and then I want to also have another slide on discussion. We find then a moderate impact on the home environment quality as measured by the home indicator that is being widely used in the United States and in many other countries. And this is particularly on a domain of the home, on the caregiver sensitivity, responsiveness, and behavioral strategies. And that's very consistent with the Programa Crece con Seu Filho curriculum, that we find an impact on that particular area. There are null effects on parental involvement in encouraging activities that promote child learning and development, but also we know from the literature that those outcomes are the most difficult to change. There are null effects on child development that, as I said before, might be related to households having very few visits. And we didn't see either the program affecting the likelihood of a household receiving the Estrategia Salud de Familia visits, And these results suggest that the program did not displace the pre-existing service, which is very important for this literature on integrating services of child development into existing health services. Our results align with others meta-analyses that find that even if home visits increase parental knowledge and investment in children, they might not always necessarily impact child development. And it's also in line with a meta-analysis from the US that finds that interventions based on pediatric consultations, so similar in terms of the role, the profile of the staff, have moderate, not big impacts on parenting practices. So I go into the last slide for a discussion that I think is useful for, particularly for policy making. So integrating home visits into the health system might facilitate scale up of early childhood development programs that have such high returns in terms of increasing future productivity and decreasing inequality, and then reach more children. However, this evaluation shows that there is some promise, but there are challenges associated to the integration. Our results particularly emphasize the importance of taking into account the pre-existing workload of the core service, in this case, the Estrategia Salud de la Familia, which can contribute to poor compliance and low intensity in the other service. And basically, the question remaining is, how do we get workers to actually do the visits they are supposed to, and the mother and caregivers to accept them? Do we have really high case loads in the existing services, or are health workers already overworked and the program had unrealistic expectations? And how do we address those challenges? We did try, as I explained, monetary incentives with the bonuses and the tablets for the best community health worker, and also decreasing workload, probably not too much, just a little bit, we decreased the workload, but it seems the impact was very marginal and only on those community health workers that were already visiting children a lot. So 2 ideas for further research and improving implementation of this type of programs is probably a better community health worker supervision and support schemes, like in China and the Jamaica studies, and this in line with what Christopher was presenting before. But also, it was very surprising for us to see the minimal impact of the extrinsic motivation, the monetary bonuses, on the number of visits. And this suggests that it might be necessary to motivate personnel targeting more intrinsic motivations. Thank you very much. And I think we might have 5 to 10 minutes for questions, if there are any.
You have 5 minutes left, yes.
5, okay.
Florence, actually, I have a question, and I was basically they are devoting about 40% of their time to the home visit, diverting from other tasks. So do you observe? I mean, since you have data at micro area, do you have any impact on? You see any negative impact on health promotion outcomes, something that might have been affected by the reduced time schedule of the nurses, of the community health workers?
Well, no, we didn't. So we look at 2 different things: health outcomes in the children to see if there was a negative impact in diarrhea, immunizations, and breastfeeding, many things, and there is no impact on final outcomes, but also on the utilization and the actual visits of the health visit, the Estrategia Salud de la Familia, and we didn't see a negative impact. So it's quite interesting that they somehow, but at the same time, it might be why we didn't have an impact on child development. They did manage to not forget the other part very nicely, but probably that was what they couldn't increase the child development module at the sufficient level.
I see. And actually, you know, like one question you are saying that, you know, possibly the change in the home environment is too small, but it could also be that the ones that improved their home environment are also the ones where kids had the worst measure to start with. So if we think of any complementarity between initial skills of the children and a home environment, can just be that those kids needed a much larger boost in a home environment to see any change in their development outcomes. So I wonder if you have done any type of interaction between the development, the baseline measure of child development.
So you suggesting, yeah, we did check heterogeneous impact by the child development of the child at baseline, but I think you're saying that maybe we also could look at, on the parenting side, the parenting impacts by the child development at baseline. No, I don't remember if we could see that. Mm-hmm. Okay, so I guess there are no more questions for neither of the speakers, Ciro, Christopher, or me. It was a very interesting session. Thank you so much. I hope the presenters had good comments and questions, and let's keep participating on the other modules of LASEA then. Thank you very much. Have a great day.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you.